Welcome to the Sleepy Scribe. After all your endless wandering across the internet, you've finally arrived, hopefully ready to drift off peacefully with today's story. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and how late it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our listeners reach. And if you enjoy these videos, subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's begin. The summer air over Pella in 356 BCE was thick with the hum of cicadas, their song rising and falling in waves like the tide against the stone walls of the Macedonian palace. The night was warm, scented with the faint sweetness of wild thyme drifting in from the hills, and the moon hung like a polished silver coin above the city's tiled roofs. Inside the palace, corridors glowed with the trembling light of oil lamps, their golden halos dancing along walls painted with scenes of hunts and battles, lions mid-leap, horses forever galloping in strokes of ochre and black. Somewhere deep within those echoing halls, the Queen of Macedon labored to bring forth her child. Olympias was no ordinary queen. Daughter of Neoptolemus of Epirus, she carried herself with the poise of one born to rule and the fire of someone who believed the gods had a personal stake in her destiny. Her dark hair clung damply to her temples as she gripped the carved bed frame, each wave of pain like a thunderclap in her body. But her eyes, the deep green of forest leaves after rain, shone with something more than the strain of childbirth. They gleamed with conviction, with the belief that what she brought into the world tonight was not merely a son, but a legend. In the courtyard beyond her chamber, priests of Zeus Ammon murmured prayers, and the sharp, resinous smell of burning laurel drifted upward in spirals. There were whispers in the palace about dreams she had confided to her attendants, one of a thunderbolt striking her womb, another of a serpent coiled beside her in bed. These were no ordinary dreams, they said, but omens. Some believed they proved that the father of the child was not Philip of Macedon at all, but Zeus himself, come down in mortal form as he had done in the myths of old. Philip, for his part, was away that night, campaigning in Thrace, but a messenger had been dispatched with urgency. He was a man accustomed to omens himself, and not one to dismiss them lightly. Months earlier, his seers had told him that his wife's child would be as bold as a lion and as restless as the sea, destined to rule not merely Macedon but lands where the sun turns back in its course. The midwives worked swiftly, speaking in low voices, their hands deft and sure. One, a woman named Myrene who had served in the palace for decades, leaned close to Olympias. "Breathe, my queen. The gods watch tonight." And then, with a cry sharp as a falcon's call, the child was born. His first wail cut through the still air, strong and insistent, and Myrene, wiping the child clean, paused. "He looks at me," she whispered, astonished. "Already he looks at me as if he knows something." He was named Alexandros, defender of men, a name that rolled like bronze over stone. His skin was flushed with life, his hair soft and already kissed by a strange golden hue that would catch the sun like fire in years to come. Olympias, exhausted but radiant, held him close, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest. She kissed his brow and murmured, "You will be more than a king, my son. The world will be your hearth, and the sky your roof." Even as the palace settled into the hush that follows great events, far away in distant Olympia, another drama unfolded. That same night, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the world, was engulfed in flames. Pilgrims and priests watched in horror as its great cedar beams cracked and fell, sparks dancing upward like swarming fireflies. Later, the historian Plutarch would write that the goddess was absent from her temple that night, attending instead to the birth of Alexander in Macedon. Superstition wrapped itself tightly around this coincidence, as if the universe itself had chosen to mark his arrival with a cosmic flair. In the days that followed, the boy's birth was the talk of the court. Courtiers, merchants, and foreign envoys came bearing gifts, woven swaddling from Ionia, small ivory figurines from Carthage, a foal from Thessaly said to be descended from the finest war horses. Musicians played lyres and flutes in the palace courtyard, and children tossed flower petals in the paths of those who came to see the infant prince. Yet not all eyes shone with goodwill. Power in Macedon was a delicate thing, and every new heir was a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples of ambition and suspicion across the realm. One afternoon, an old seer named Telmessus was brought to the palace. He bent over the sleeping infant, tracing the shape of his tiny hands with fingers gnarled like olive roots. "This one will not be content with what he inherits," he murmured. "He will break the limits of the known world, but each mile will cost him dearly." Olympias listened without flinching, for she had already decided. Her son's destiny would be pursued no matter the price. Alexander's early days were filled with the mingled sense of cedar chests, the cool touch of marble floors beneath bare feet, and the sound of hoofbeats from the palace stables. Olympias often took him to the temple, where shafts of sunlight pierced the dim interior and incense curled lazily toward the rafters. She whispered tales of Achilles and Heracles into his tiny ear, speaking of bravery and glory as if they were as essential to a man's life as bread and water. Sometimes, she even placed a small bronze sword in his cradle, a symbolic weight that seemed almost to make him stir in his sleep. Beyond the palace, Macedon itself was stirring. Philip's armies were growing stronger, his influence pushing outward into Greece. Every campaign brought new wealth, new allies, and new enemies. In the marketplaces, traders from distant lands told of wonders across the sea, golden cities, deserts where the stars looked close enough to pluck from the sky, rivers so wide it took days to cross. These stories sank into the air of Pella like seeds into fertile soil, and though Alexander could not yet understand them, the world was already calling to him, faint and irresistible. In quiet moments, Olympias would rock him, her gaze fixed beyond the palace walls as if seeing not the hills of Macedon but a vast horizon. "Remember this, my son," she would murmur, though he was far too young to grasp her words. "The gods favor the bold. When you hear the world whisper, do not merely listen, answer." And so the boy grew, swaddled not just in cloth but in prophecy, ambition, and the unshakable belief that he had been born for something greater than any prince before him. The cicadas sang on in the summer air, and the moon waxed and waned above Pella, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed his birth, a quiet certainty took root. History had shifted that night, though it would be years before the earth felt the full weight of his footsteps. From the moment Alexander could form words, stories were as much a part of his diet as bread and figs, and among those stories none were told with greater reverence than the sagas of gods and heroes. Olympias believed, knew, that her son was touched by divine blood, and she intended that he believe it too. In the cool stone chambers of the palace, with oil lamps casting long flickering shadows on the walls painted in rich blues and reds, she would sit with him curled against her side, her voice low and melodic as she wove the ancient tales into his very bones. She told him of Heracles, son of Zeus, whose strength could bend steel and whose courage had tamed the wildest of beasts. She spoke of Achilles, swift-footed and untamed, who chose a short life of glory over a long life of obscurity, and whose rage could shake the walls of Troy. But these were not mere bedtime entertainments. They were lessons, each one seeded with the idea that Alexander was heir not just to a throne, but to a legacy carved in the annals of myth. Olympias herself practiced rites that set her apart from other queens. She was a devotee of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and divine frenzy, and her ceremonies were whispered about by the more traditional courtiers. On certain nights, Alexander would peek from behind a colonnade and see his mother moving among a circle of women clad in flowing white, their hair crowned with ivy, holding aloft torches that hissed and sputtered, their chants echoing in the marble hall until it seemed the air itself vibrated with some otherworldly rhythm. Once, in the soft light of early morning after such a rite, she sat before him and said, "Your blood is not entirely of this earth, my son. When you feel the urge to go where no man has gone, that is the call of your true father." Whether he fully understood or not, the boy felt an electric thrill at her words. Philip, for his part, ensured that his son's education matched his mother's mythic ambitions. He summoned the greatest minds in Greece to tutor Alexander, and none was greater than Aristotle himself. The philosopher arrived at Mieza, a sanctuary of learning shaded by plane trees and cooled by the bubbling of nearby springs, and there began to shape the young prince's mind with the tools of reason and observation. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander learned not just the art of persuasion and the mechanics of government, but the intricate workings of nature. They would walk together through the groves, Aristotle pointing out the veins in a leaf, the habits of ants, the way a swallow's flight could predict the change of seasons. "A king who knows the world only through the sword is half a king," Aristotle told him one day, as they stood beside a pond watching ripples spread from a thrown pebble. "To rule, you must understand the currents that move men's hearts, the patterns that bind the earth and sky." Alexander listened, his gaze as intent on the water as if he could see in it the reflection of his future. Yet for all the philosopher's wisdom, it was the stories of the past that fired his imagination most fiercely. He devoured Homer's Iliad, carrying a copy with him even as he grew older, reciting lines of Achilles' wrath under his breath as if invoking a spell. When Aristotle once asked him who he wished to emulate, Alexander answered without hesitation, Achilles. For he lived as if each day were worth a lifetime. But his admiration came not without reflection. "He also died because of his pride," Alexander added quietly, as though testing the taste of the word in his mouth. Outside of lessons, he tested his body as rigorously as his mind. He ran through the orchards, leapt over streams, and trained with the wooden spear until his hands blistered. He wrestled with boys older and stronger than himself, refusing to yield even when pinned to the ground, his eyes burning with a defiance that made the older boys uneasy. Once, after being thrown to the dirt by a towering youth from Thessaly, he scrambled to his feet and said through clenched teeth, again, as if the loss had only stoked the fire in him. At meals, he would sometimes sit between Olympias and Philip, looking from one to the other as they spoke of politics and omens, of treaties and wars. He learned early that the world was not merely a place of gods and heroes, but of men whose ambitions could be as dangerous as any monster in a story. Yet, as the years passed, he began to feel a strange merging of the two realms in his own heart, the sense that he was meant to move in both, to act among mortals but with the stride of one touched by immortality. And so his childhood was a tapestry woven of two threads, the measured reasoning of Aristotle, grounding him in the realities of the world, and the intoxicating tales of Olympias, lifting his gaze toward the realm of legend. The boy who chased dogs in the market and wrestled in the grass was the same boy who lay awake at night under the marble arches of the palace, staring at the moon and wondering if Achilles, looking up from the plains of Troy, had ever felt the same pull toward the farthest horizons. It was a pull that would grow stronger with each passing season, tugging him away from the sheltered groves of Mieza and toward the wide, dangerous world beyond. The sun over Pella poured down like molten gold the day the great horse was brought before Philip's court, its glossy black coat rippling like silk over muscle, its eyes bright as polished obsidian and just as sharp. The creature's nostrils flared with every breath, sending out quick snorts of steam into the cool morning air, and its hooves struck the packed earth with the impatience of a warrior eager for battle. The handlers struggled to control it, the thick leather reins straining against its jerking head. It was a Thessalian stallion, bred from the finest war stock, and its name, Bucephalus, would one day echo across continents. But on that morning, it was known only as a beast too wild for any man to tame. Courtiers and soldiers stood in a loose half-circle around the animal, their murmurs filling the air like the rustle of dry reeds. Philip watched with arms folded, his one eye narrowing as another handler attempted to mount, only to be thrown violently to the ground in a spray of dust. The man groaned, clutching his shoulder, and the horse reared again, lashing out with its front hooves, the sunlight catching on the polished bronze of the bit in its mouth. "A fine animal wasted," one nobleman muttered. "Send it back before it kills someone." Alexander, still in the flush of youth but already standing with a certain unshakable poise, stepped forward from the crowd. His hair caught the light like a crown of pale fire, and his gaze was fixed intently on the horse, studying it with the same seriousness he might give to an enemy commander. "He's afraid of his own shadow," Alexander said at last, his voice clear and calm enough to cut through the din. Philip turned his head slightly, half amused and half incredulous. "And what would you know of such matters, boy?" "Enough to ride him," Alexander replied without hesitation. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but the prince did not flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the great black stallion, moving with the deliberate, unhurried gait of someone approaching a skittish deer. Bucephalus's ears flicked back, his body tense, but Alexander kept his voice low and steady, speaking softly to the animal as though to a nervous friend. When he reached the reins, he did not pull them hard, but instead turned the horse gently toward the sun so that its shadow fell behind it. "There," he murmured, "nothing to fear now." Then, in one smooth motion, he swung himself onto the stallion's back. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. The horse shifted, muscles coiling for another violent buck, but Alexander leaned forward, his hands firm yet light, his legs pressing just enough to guide without constraining. They moved together, tentatively at first, then faster, Alexander letting the animal run, letting it feel the wind in its maner and the freedom in its stride. Soon they were galloping across the open field beyond the court, the stallion's hooves drumming the earth in a rhythm like distant thunder. The crowd turned to follow their path, shielding their eyes from the glare as the pair became a blur of motion against the horizon. When Alexander finally slowed and returned, both rider and horse were slick with sweat, but there was no wildness in Bucephalus now, only the proud, controlled energy of a warrior awaiting command. Philip stared at his son for a long moment, and when Alexander slid from the saddle, the king's voice carried over the courtyard, gruff yet tinged with something like wonder. "My boy," he said, "you must find a kingdom great enough for your ambitions, for Macedon will not hold you." The words struck Alexander like a spark on dry tinder. To him, this was more than praise. It was a recognition of the restlessness that had always burned in him, the same restlessness that made him lean into the wind on Bucephalus's back as though trying to outrun the edges of the world itself. From that day, the stallion was his constant companion, a creature as fierce and loyal as any comrade in arms. They trained together, rode together, even seemed to understand each other without words. When Alexander walked through the stables, Bucephalus would lift his head and whicker softly, the sound oddly gentle for such a powerful beast. In the evenings, Alexander would sometimes rest a hand against the stallion's warm flank, feeling the steady thud of its heartbeat and thinking of all the lands they might cross together. That bond, between boy and horse, prince and steed, became part of his legend long before he ever led an army. And in some quiet, unspoken way, it also became a mirror for the boy himself, wild at first, untamed and mistrustful, but destined to be guided not by brute force, but by vision and courage into the open fields of history. Life within the Macedonian palace was like the inside of a jeweled chest, brilliant, ornate, and heavy with treasures, yet rattling with sharp edges that could cut the unwary. For Alexander, childhood and adolescence were not only shaped by battles in training fields or lessons beneath the shady plane trees of Mieza, but also by the storms that often rolled through the royal household. His mother, Olympias, possessed a beauty that could command a hall into silence and a temper that could split it apart. She was fiercely protective of her son, convinced of his divine origins, and equally convinced that any slight against him was a slight against destiny itself. Philip, on the other hand, though proud of his son's talents, had the mind of a general and the instincts of a statesman, his gaze fixed on alliances, treaties, and the expansion of his power across Greece. Between them ran an invisible fault line, one that widened as the years passed. In the great megaron where banquets were held, wine flowed as freely as the laughter of the courtiers, yet beneath the music of flutes and lyres, there was the constant hum of political maneuvering. Philip's marriages, several of them, taken for alliance rather than love, brought new queens into the palace, each with her own family, her own ambitions, and her own potential claim to power. Olympias watched them like a hawk circling intruders, her voice honeyed in public but edged with steel in private. Alexander, still young but perceptive, learned early that in the court of Macedon, A smile could be a shield, and a gift could be a dagger. The tension came to a head one fateful evening during a wedding feast. Philip had married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman whose youth and beauty made her a dazzling ornament at his side, but whose presence in the palace was a direct challenge to Olympia's. As the torches blazed and wine cups were refilled, a drunken uncle of Cleopatra, Attalus, stood and raised a toast, his words thick with wine and arrogance. "May this union give us a true Macedonian heir," he declared, a cruel implication hanging in the smoky air. Olympia stiffened, her fingers tightening around her cup. Alexander, seated nearby, felt the heat rise in his chest. "Do you mean to call me a bastard?" he shot back, his voice cutting clean through the hall. The feast fell into a charged silence. Attalus sneered, but before he could answer, Alexander hurled the wine cup in his direction, the metal ringing against the stone floor. Philip, who had been watching with an expression somewhere between amusement and irritation, suddenly lurched to his feet. Fueled by drink, he drew his sword and staggered toward his son. But his limp betrayed him, and he stumbled, nearly falling. Alexander's voice, cold and sharp, rang out across the room. "Here is the man who would cross from Europe into Asia, yet cannot cross from one couch to another without falling." Gasps rippled through the guests, and Philip's face darkened like a storm front. In that instant, the fragile threads binding father and son seemed ready to snap. Olympias left the palace not long after, retreating to her native Epirus with Alexander accompanying her for a time. By the time Byzantium finally negotiated terms of surrender, Alexander had witnessed the full cycle of strategy, patience, and consequence. He understood that victories could be won without reckless slaughter, that intelligence and timing could achieve what brute force alone could not, and that leadership demanded a mind capable of holding both compassion and calculation simultaneously. It was in these days, among the walls of a city resisting conquest, that Alexander first began to feel the weight of the destiny his mother had whispered about, the pull toward lands and victories far beyond the familiar mountains of Macedon. Every glance over the ramparts, every observation of a soldier's fear or bravery, became a thread weaving into the fabric of the man he was slowly becoming. A commander, a strategist, a prince poised to step from the shadow of kings into the sweep of history itself. The mountains of Illyria rose like jagged teeth along the northern borders of Macedon, their peaks shrouded in mist and mystery, and it was here that Alexander first encountered a test of both courage and cunning that would shape the steel of his character. The air was crisp with the scent of pine resin and the earthy tang of morning dew, and the winds carried the faint, distant cries of eagles circling above the cliffs. Philip had ordered a campaign to secure the borders against unruly Illyrian tribes, men known for their ferocity, skill with the sword, and unyielding resistance to foreign rule. Alexander, now nearing adulthood, rode at the head of a cavalry detachment, his armor catching the dawn light, the familiar weight of Bucephalus beneath him like an extension of his own body. Scouts returned with reports of hidden paths and ambush points, their voices low and urgent. "They know these mountains better than we ever will," one officer said, tension sharpening his features. Alexander listened carefully, weighing each word, each pause, aware that misjudgment here could cost lives. "Then we must think like them," he replied, his voice calm but carrying a conviction that made seasoned men straighten in surprise. "The enemy's strength is their familiarity. We will use their confidence against them." The campaign through Illyria was grueling. Narrow passes forced troops to march in single file, cliffs dropping sharply to roaring rivers below, and Alexander observed the soldiers' nerves, noting which men hesitated and which pressed forward without faltering. At night, he would study maps and plans by the flickering light of campfires, often walking among the tents to speak with soldiers personally, asking questions not only of tactics but of their fears and suggestions. It was here that he began to understand the importance of morale, the subtle art of leadership that relied on trust, respect, and shared purpose rather than mere command. The Illyrians struck at dusk, descending from hidden paths with a suddenness that made the Macedonian troops stagger, their shields ringing with the shock of impact. Alexander rode among them, issuing calm, precise orders, repositioning men with a deftness that belied his age, and rallying those who faltered with a voice that carried authority and reassurance simultaneously. In the chaos of combat, he demonstrated an instinct for reading the flow of battle, anticipating enemy movements and adapting plans on the fly, a skill that would later define his campaigns across continents. After days of skirmishes, the Macedonians gained a narrow advantage, capturing high ground that allowed them to control the passes. Alexander, at the head of his cavalry, led a daring charge that surprised the Illyrians, turning retreat into rout. When the dust settled, he stood atop a ridge overlooking the fleeing tribes, chest heaving, eyes alight not only with triumph but with the sober understanding that victory was always intertwined with loss and consequence. In the quiet aftermath, as the soldiers tended to their wounds and set up temporary camps, Alexander found moments to reflect, walking through the forests and listening to the wind whisper through the pine needles. He considered the bravery of his men, the cunning of his foes, and the weight of decisions that had determined life or death that very day. Even then, the pull of destiny he had felt as a child, whispered by Olympias and nurtured through tales of Heracles and Achilles, seemed to grow stronger, pressing him toward a future that would stretch far beyond the mountains of Illyria. And yet, in those reflective hours, he also understood the delicate balance between ambition and humility, between the hunger for glory and the responsibility for those who followed him. It was a lesson learned not in the study halls of Aristotle nor in the pampered corridors of Pella, but in the sweat, dust, and peril of battle, where courage alone could not secure triumph, and wisdom was measured in both action and restraint. As night fell over the rugged peaks, Alexander sat beside a small fire, Bucephalus tethered nearby, feeling the steady warmth of the horse beneath his hand. The stars emerged above the cliffs, vast and countless, and he thought not only of the mountains he had conquered today but of the lands, peoples, and stories waiting beyond the horizon, places where history itself might bend beneath the force of his ambition. Even amid campaigns and the roar of battle, Alexander's education continued, carried not in scrolls alone but in the living lessons of life itself. Aristotle's influence remained a steady current beneath the turbulence of Macedonian politics and military expeditions. During brief periods of respite, the young prince would return to the sanctuary at Mieza, where the philosopher's voice guided him through the labyrinth of knowledge that stretched from ethics to zoology, from rhetoric to the stars above. The grove of plane trees offered shade and solace, their leaves whispering as though urging the boy to listen closely, not only to words but to the music of the world. Alexander learned that understanding was a form of power, as critical as spear and shield. He dissected the habits of bees and ants, tracing their work with meticulous attention, and Aristotle would nod approvingly, explaining how these observations mirrored human society, the way order emerged from seeming chaos, the way cooperation and hierarchy shaped outcomes. "A king," Aristotle said one afternoon, the sunlight glinting off the edges of his scrolls, "must understand the world in all its forms. Not merely men and cities, but rivers, animals, and stars. Only then can he see the patterns that bind all things." Beyond natural philosophy, the lessons of ethics and politics burned brightest. Aristotle challenged Alexander to consider justice, the role of a ruler, and the responsibilities owed to subjects. The young prince would pose his own questions, sharp and deliberate. If men obey out of fear, is that loyalty? If subjects prosper but the king dies in the process, who truly wins? The philosopher would smile, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes allowing silence to settle as though the weight of the question alone was a teacher. During these days, Alexander also cultivated a taste for literature and poetry. Homer remained a constant companion, and the prince's recitations of the Iliad were not mere memorization but an engagement with the strategies, passions, and flaws of heroes. He compared his own ambitions to Achilles, pondering the choice between a short life of grandeur and a long life of quiet obscurity. But he also began to see the subtleties, the value of cunning, of persuasion, of diplomacy, that could achieve what raw strength alone could not. Occasionally, Aristotle would stage debates with him before the assembled tutors and soldiers, testing his reasoning, forcing him to consider perspectives contrary to his instincts. These exercises were both grueling and exhilarating, sharpening Alexander's mind like a whetstone to steel. And yet, education for Alexander was not confined to philosophical discourse or poetry. Philip ensured that the prince observed councils of war, negotiations with allies, and the delicate intricacies of Macedonian court life. Alexander learned the language of persuasion, the art of reading intent from posture and tone, and the subtle interplay of flattery and caution that could shift loyalties before a single sword was drawn. In these moments, he practiced patience and discernment, absorbing lessons in leadership that no battlefield alone could teach. Between these periods of study and strategy, Alexander allowed himself moments of play and mischief, for even a prince touched by ambition could not escape the joys of youth. He raced across the fields with Bucephalus, challenged companions to wrestling and mock duels, and sometimes lingered in the market, observing the lives of ordinary people, noting their fears, hopes, and humor. These glimpses into everyday life enriched his understanding of the world he would one day govern. The interplay between rigorous education, military training, and personal observation shaped Alexander into a unique amalgam. A scholar with the instincts of a warrior, a commander who could weigh the morality of his actions as carefully as the tactics, a boy whose curiosity remained as sharp as the spear he practiced with at dawn. Aristotle's guidance, combined with the lessons drawn from the palace and battlefield, imbued him with an awareness that greatness was not simply inherited or seized, but cultivated through discipline, insight, and unyielding reflection. And as he stood beneath the whispering plane trees, absorbing the cadence of leaves and the distant murmurs of the Macedonian plains, Alexander felt the slow, steady pull of destiny once more. It was a call that demanded more than courage. It required wisdom, strategy, and an understanding of the world that could only be forged through the combined fires of intellect and experience, a preparation that would soon meet the vast challenges awaiting beyond the familiar horizons of Macedon. As Alexander matured, the pull of the wider Greek world became impossible to ignore. The cities of the south, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, whispered of culture, philosophy, and war in equal measure, their porticos alive with the clatter of debate and the music of lyres. Macedon had long been considered peripheral by the Greeks, its kings respected for their armies but seldom admired for their minds. Yet Philip, ever ambitious, sought to unify Greece under his banner, and Alexander, now in the cusp of manhood, observed this delicate dance with keen interest, sensing that the fate of nations often hung on subtleties invisible to the untrained eye. In the markets and forums of the Salon, Alexander watched merchants argue over the price of grain, philosophers debate the nature of virtue, and soldiers practice maneuvers that, while less disciplined than Macedon's phalanx, displayed ingenuity born of centuries of conflict. He began to recognize the nuances of city-state politics, noting alliances built on marriage, oaths, and mutual interest, and the fragility of such bonds when ambition pressed too hard against tradition. During one diplomatic mission to Corinth, he accompanied Philip to a gathering of leaders from across Greece. The marble halls were rich with murals depicting battles of myth and legend, and Alexander could almost hear the ghosts of past leaders whispering in the shadows. Speeches were given, promises exchanged, and subtle threats disguised as compliments were delivered with perfect civility. Alexander absorbed every gesture, every nuance of language, every flicker of expression. He noted how Athens wielded prestige, Sparta relied on discipline, and Thebes leveraged cunning, each city's power shaped not by size alone but by culture, history, and perception. Even in leisure, the lessons continued. Alexander attended symposia, where wine flowed and conversation soared from philosophy to poetry to tales of conquest. He debated with rhetoricians and scholars, testing ideas against wit and reason, sometimes surprising older men with the clarity and depth of his insights. These experiences revealed to him that leadership required more than battlefield brilliance. It demanded intellect, charisma, and the ability to navigate human ambition as skillfully as a general commanded troops. Yet, despite the grandeur of southern Greece, Alexander also noted the petty jealousies and rivalries that simmered beneath polished words. He watched alliances fracture over minor insults, saw promises broken for fleeting advantage, and recognized that the same qualities that made Greek city-states powerful, pride, ingenuity, and fierce independence, could also render them fragile. He carried these observations back to Macedon, discussing strategy and politics with Philip in long evenings beside the fire, debating methods of governance and the use of persuasion versus force. To rule men, you must first understand them, Philip would say, a hint of pride in his voice as he measured his son's responses. And to command respect, you must offer both justice and fear, in equal measure. Alexander listened, thinking not only of his father's words but of the lessons Aristotle had imparted, combining philosophy with strategy, reflection with action. As spring deepened into summer, the sense of destiny that had always lingered around him grew more insistent. He envisioned Macedon not merely as a kingdom hemmed in by mountains and enemies, but as the spearhead of a unified Greek world, poised to strike across seas and empires. At night, he would ride Bucephalus through the moonlit hills, imagining the cities of the south, the landscapes of Asia, and the heroes of legend whose courage and ambition mirrored his own burgeoning vision. Even as he slept beneath the stars, he dreamt of campaigns that would carry him far from Pella, far from the familiar scents of pine and olive, into lands painted in the histories of Homer and chroniclers, across rivers that sang of conquest and mountains crowned with the banners of kings long vanished. In these dreams, he felt the intertwining of mortal ambition and divine favor, the echo of Olympia's whispered prophecies, and the steady hand of Aristotle guiding his thoughts. The call of Greece was more than a summons to diplomacy or war. It was an invitation to step fully into the currents of history, to merge intellect and courage, strategy and passion, into a force that would reshape the world itself. And Alexander, feeling the weight and thrill of this call, understood that his destiny was no longer confined to Macedon's hills or the shadow of his father. It stretched outward, vast and uncharted, waiting for the mind, heart, and sword willing to claim it. The sun rose over Pella in a wash of molten amber, spilling light across the marble columns and tiled roofs of the city, and with it came a day of both pomp and quiet reckoning. Alexander, now approaching the cusp of adulthood, prepared for a ceremony that would solidify his place not only as heir to the Macedonian throne, but as a figure whose presence would command loyalty, awe, and curiosity. The palace was alive with movement. Attendants adjusted robes embroidered with gold and purple, guards polished bronze armor until it gleamed like captured sunlight, and musicians tuned lyres and flutes, filling the air with a tentative, anticipatory melody. Philip, towering in both stature and authority, observed the preparations with one calculating eye, aware that appearances were as crucial as lineage in securing both respect and fear among allies and rivals. Olympias hovered nearby, a mixture of pride and protective anxiety shaping every step, whispering encouragements and subtle reminders of divine favor. The ceremony began in the Great Hall, where tapestries depicting Macedon's history hung like silent witnesses to the unfolding legacy. Alexander entered with measured steps, Bucephalus tethered nearby as a symbol of the prince's strength and connection to the untamed wild. Priests recited invocations to Zeus, Heracles, and the pantheon of gods, their voices rising and falling in a cadence that seemed to wrap the hall in sacred resonance. Alexander, keeping his posture straight and gaze steady, felt the weight of expectation pressing on him, but he also felt a quiet thrill, a recognition that this moment, like many others before, was both trial and affirmation. As the crown of gold was placed upon his head, he sensed the convergence of human and divine anticipation. Courtiers murmured in approval and speculation, allies nodded respectfully, and even enemies could not hide the grudging acknowledgement of his presence. Alexander, for his part, received the symbols of office with both humility and awareness, understanding that authority without action was merely ornamentation. After the ceremonial blessings, the hall opened to a series of feasts and speeches. Diplomats from across the region spoke of allegiance, loyalty, and future campaigns, while soldiers toasted to the enduring strength of Macedon. Alexander, seated beside his father, listened with a discerning ear, noting the subtleties in language and gesture, weighing the truths, half-truths, and deceptions embedded in each statement. Throughout the day, Olympias whispered reminders of destiny and divine favor, while Philip offered pragmatic counsel grounded in politics and power. The young prince navigated these dual influences with a growing confidence, understanding that a ruler's strength lay not merely in command or lineage, but in the ability to reconcile ambition with responsibility, vision with action. Later, Alexander stepped onto a balcony overlooking the bustling streets of Pella. The sun glinted off river and rooftops, and the sounds of the city, voices, animals, the creak of carts over cobblestones, reached him as a reminder of the realm he was poised to govern. He felt a strange blend of exhilaration and solemnity, the realization that his life had already been shaped by myth, philosophy, and warfare, yet the future remained an uncharted expanse, rich with possibility and peril alike. Bucephalus shifted beside him, and Alexander laid a hand on the stallion's flank, drawing calm from the creature's steady presence. In that quiet companionship, he found a touchstone amid the formalities and expectations, a reminder of both his humanity and his capacity for mastery. By evening, the ceremonial feasts gave way to private reflection. Alexander walked through the gardens of the palace, inhaling the mingled scents of jasmine and pine, thinking of the lessons he had absorbed, the battles he had observed, and the people whose loyalty, friendship, and rivalry would shape the path before him. The day had been a performance, a declaration, and a promise all at once. Yet beneath the golden ceremony lay the unspoken understanding that a crown is not merely worn but wielded, that authority requires courage, intellect, and the capacity to see both immediate danger and distant opportunity. Alexander, feeling the steady pulse of ambition within him, knew that the coronation was both an end and a beginning. It marked his passage into a world where myth and reality intertwined, where the echoes of heroes past guided the steps of those who dared to claim their place among them. And as twilight settled over Pella, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Alexander allowed himself a moment of quiet anticipation, the unspoken promise of adventure and conquest stirring within him, a prelude to the odyssey that would carry him far beyond the familiar hills and rivers of Macedon. The city of Corinth shimmered beneath a late spring sun, its white marble columns gleaming as if dusted with starlight, and Alexander felt the weight of history pressing in with every step. The assembly of the Greek city-states, convened under Philip's guidance, had gathered to formalize the League of Corinth, a tenuous alliance intended to unify the often fractious polities of Greece under Macedonian leadership. The air was thick with anticipation, the mingled scents of olive oil, burning incense, and sea salt drifting in from the harbor, and the voices of ambassadors and generals wove together like a restless chorus. Alexander, now fully recognized as heir, stood beside Philip, observing the intricate choreography of diplomacy that he had once studied in theory but was now experiencing in flesh and blood. The assembly hall itself was a marvel, a wide expanse of polished marble with banners from each city-state hung like carefully arranged tapestries. Statues of gods and heroes lined the walls, their gazes seeming to watch the proceedings with timeless scrutiny. Alexander's eyes traced each figure, noting how power and reverence intertwined, and he reflected on Aristotle's teachings, remembering that understanding culture and symbol was as vital to leadership as understanding strategy and arms. When the time came for the oath, Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall with a clarity that surprised even seasoned diplomats. The wording was simple yet binding. All cities present would recognize Philip as the hegemon of Greece, swear to unite against the Persian Empire, and honor the agreements forged within the League. Alexander's words were measured, precise, each syllable a promise of intent and a reflection of confidence. The reactions of the assembly were varied. Some nodded with relief or satisfaction, others masked concern behind polite applause. But Alexander, attuned to subtleties, caught the flicker of doubt in the eyes of certain representatives, the barely perceptible tension in posture that hinted at grudges and hidden agendas. After the formalities, the hall echoed with the soft sounds of conversation and negotiation. Alexander moved among the delegates, listening as much as he spoke, asking questions that revealed his comprehension of both military strategy and civic law, his curiosity extending beyond mere protocol into the practicalities of governance, supply lines, and the readiness of allied forces. In the quiet moments between speeches, he observed the soldiers stationed for ceremonial purposes, noting their discipline, the alignment of spears, and the unspoken hierarchy among their ranks. These details, seemingly minor, were pieces of a larger puzzle. Leadership demanded awareness of the world in both grand and minute scales. That evening, as the sun dipped into the Ionian Sea, Alexander walked through the port of Corinth, listening to the lapping of waves against ships, the calls of merchants, and the distant laughter of children. The alliance was secure in theory, but he knew, from studying the ambitions and rivalries of the Greek city-states, that unity would always be fragile, held together by careful negotiation, mutual interest, and the occasional display of force. Beside him, Bucephalus shifted, his black coat catching the last light of day. The stallion had been more than a companion through battle. He had become a symbol of Alexander's growing mastery over the untamed, a reminder that command required patience, courage, and respect for strength. In these reflective hours, Alexander considered the duality of leadership, the necessity to inspire loyalty while maintaining authority, to balance compassion with calculated fear, to act decisively while remaining adaptable. He understood that the League of Corinth was both a triumph and a test, a microcosm of the challenges that awaited him beyond the mountains of Greece, across rivers and seas into lands whose names were whispered with both awe and caution. As night fell, lanterns casting flickering light along the colonnades, Alexander contemplated the oath he had taken, the weight of alliances, and the responsibilities that would follow. The stars above Corinth glimmered like countless eyes witnessing his resolve, and he felt the familiar, insistent pull of destiny, urging him toward conquests, wisdom, and a legacy that would stretch far beyond the borders of Macedon, touching the cities, cultures, and peoples that lay over the horizon. The palace of Pella, usually alive with the rhythmic clatter of daily life, fell into an uneasy hush one summer morning, the air heavy with the scent of heated stone and pine smoke. Rumors had begun to circulate, fragments of whispers carried on the lips of servants and soldiers alike, of plots woven in the shadows, of danger lurking where no eyes could see. Philip, ever cautious and calculating, had enemies both within and beyond Macedon, discontented nobles, rival claimants, and foreign emissaries whose ambitions collided with his own. Alexander, now more than a boy but still not fully a man, watched the tension ripple through the palace with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, aware that even the familiar corridors could conceal treachery. It began subtly, as such things often do. A messenger arrived late at night with a cryptic note, a guard reported unusual activity in the barracks, and attendants whispered of a stranger spotted near the king's private chambers. Alexander, trained to read both people and circumstances, sensed the gravity beneath the murmurings. He approached his father carefully, leaning close in the dim light of the council room. "Father," he said, voice low but steady, "something stirs in the shadows. We must discern friend from foe before the hour passes." Philip's one eye, sharp and glinting, met his son's with a mixture of pride and concern. "You read the air well, my son. But shadows are slippery. Sometimes the enemy is obvious, sometimes he wears the mask of loyalty." Over the next days, the palace became a landscape of suspicion and vigilance. Courtiers were watched discreetly, messages scrutinized, and patrols doubled along the outer walls. The victory at Cheronia sent ripples through Greece, a mixture of awe, envy, and unease that permeated both city-states and palace halls. Macedon stood ascendant, but with triumph came the subtle, persistent undercurrents of ambition, jealousy, and the fragile politics of succession. Alexander, now recognized by many as his father's rightful heir, began to understand that the battles for power were not always fought on open plains but often within the shadows of loyalty and trust. The corridors of Pella, once familiar and secure, now echoed with whispers. Courtiers debated alliances, generals measured loyalty, and the faintest glance or carefully placed word could ignite suspicion. Alexander observed with the growing acumen of a strategist, recognizing that perception could be as potent as sword or phalanx. Philip, ever aware of these dynamics, involved his son more directly in matters of state, presenting him with decisions and dilemmas that required judgment, foresight, and the courage to act decisively. Alexander's presence at council meetings became a blend of observation and subtle influence, his questions probing the assumptions of advisors and testing the integrity of their counsel. Olympias, ever vigilant, reminded Alexander of the precarious balance between respect and caution. "Remember, my son," she would whisper in the dim of candlelit chambers, "a throne can be secured by birth, but it is maintained by awareness, patience, and the strength to see hidden hands before they strike." Within the palace, the line between friend and foe blurred. Close advisors sometimes acted out of self-interest, their loyalties conditional, while foreign envoys offered compliments that carried veiled threats. Alexander began to cultivate an understanding that leadership required not just intelligence and courage but also the ability to read nuance, to anticipate betrayal, and to command respect through action as well as presence. Even within the royal family, subtle tensions played out. Olympias's protective nature sometimes clashed with Philip's pragmatism, and Alexander observed the delicate dance between love, ambition, and influence, absorbing lessons about negotiation, compromise, and the subtle shaping of perception. During this period, Alexander also began to consolidate his own network of loyal companions, men whose skill, courage, and insight he could rely upon in both council and combat. These friendships, forged in shared challenge and mutual respect, would become the backbone of his future campaigns, a cadre of individuals who shared his vision and ambition, yet whose temperaments and insights complemented his own. Beyond the walls of Pella, the people of Macedon watched the rising prince with a mixture of fascination and expectation. Alexander's victories and displays of leadership, even in subtle ways, elevated his reputation, stirring hope and curiosity among soldiers, merchants, and common citizens alike. It became clear that his presence alone inspired confidence, a quality essential for a future king whose ambitions stretched beyond regional dominance. Nights were often spent in reflection, Alexander walking the quiet palace gardens, the scents of jasmine and pine mingling in the cool air. He considered the lessons of Cheronia, the subtle intrigues of the court, and the responsibilities now pressing upon him. Each thought, each observation, became a thread weaving into his understanding of power, strategy, and the human heart. He understood that succession was not merely a matter of inheritance, but a continuous negotiation between authority, perception, and action. The shadows of ambition and rivalry would never fully dissipate, yet Alexander recognized that his ability to navigate them with intelligence, decisiveness, and courage would determine not only his survival but the scope of the legacy he might leave. As dawn approached, painting the palace in the soft glow of gold and rose, Alexander mounted Bucephalus, feeling the familiar strength of his companion beneath him. The quiet of early morning allowed his mind to stretch across the horizon of possibilities, imagining campaigns, alliances, and challenges yet to come. The world beyond Macedon beckoned, filled with promise, peril, and the intricate web of power and destiny. In these moments, Alexander embraced both the thrill and gravity of succession, recognizing that to inherit a throne was to inherit the responsibility to see, understand, and shape the future. And with that awareness, he felt the first stirrings of a vision that would carry him far beyond the familiar hills and valleys of his homeland, toward the vast, uncharted landscapes of conquest, ambition, and history itself. The city of the Salon gleamed beneath a sun that bathed the marble streets in honeyed light, and the air was thick with the scents of fresh bread, olive oil, and the sweet perfume of blooming oleanders. Alexander rode through the city, Bucephalus' hooves striking the stone with a rhythmic echo, as courtiers and townsfolk alike paused to watch the young prince, heir to the Macedonian throne, move with both confidence and grace. It was a day of ceremony, a celebration that blended politics, family, and spectacle. The marriage of Alexander to a princess from Epirus, a union designed to strengthen alliances and secure loyalty beyond Macedon's borders. The palace was alive with preparations. Gold-embroidered robes hung on racks, musicians tuned lyres and flutes in anticipation, and the air buzzed with whispered excitement and anxious speculation. Olympias moved among the attendants with a purposeful intensity, ensuring that every detail reflected both grandeur and the underlying assertion of Macedonian power. Alexander, for his part, maintained composure, aware that the event was more than a personal milestone. It was a statement to allies and rivals alike, a demonstration of diplomacy performed through ceremony. The procession to the ceremonial hall wound through the streets, the banners of Macedon fluttering above, a testament to both history and ambition. Alexander, mounted atop Bucephalus, observed the throngs of citizens, merchants, and visiting dignitaries, noting subtle expressions, shifting allegiances, and the undercurrent of political calculation that accompanied every bow and polite smile. The bride, radiant in robes of gold and deep crimson, entered the hall with an elegance that mirrored Alexander's own presence. The union, solemnized by priests invoking Zeus, Hera, and the Pantheon, was more than ritual. It was a binding of kingdoms, an intertwining of dynasties, and a promise of future cooperation in both war and governance. Amid the ceremony, Alexander reflected on the nature of power and alliance. Marriage, he understood, was as much a strategic instrument as any phalanx or cavalry maneuver. The ability to intertwine families, secure loyalty, and project stability through symbols and acts of tradition was a skill that would become invaluable in the years ahead. After the formalities, the hall erupted in feasting, music, and conversation. Diplomats and generals toasted the union, sharing both genuine camaraderie and veiled counsel, subtle warnings hidden beneath compliments. Alexander moved among the guests, engaging in dialogue with tact and discernment, aware that each interaction had the potential to influence the delicate balance of loyalty and ambition. The evening also offered moments of levity. Courtiers challenged Alexander to playful contests, jesting about his skill in archery, wrestling, and horsemanship. The young prince accepted with good humor, his competitive spirit shining through, earning laughter and camaraderie even amid the formalities of diplomacy. As the night deepened and lanterns flickered, Alexander found moments for quiet reflection in the palace gardens. The fragrance of night-blooming jasmine mingled with the cool breeze, and the distant laughter of the celebrants carried across the terraces. He thought of his father, Philip, whose ambition and strategic mind had shaped Macedon's rise, and of Aristotle, whose teachings continued to guide his thoughts on ethics, leadership, and the human heart. In these moments, Alexander considered the intertwining of personal and political life, understanding that even private decisions could ripple across kingdoms and alter the course of history. The marriage of diplomacy, he realized, required both subtlety and courage, the ability to navigate honor, expectation, and ambition with skill and foresight. And as he walked beneath the moonlit arches, Bucephalus tethered nearby, Alexander felt the steady pull of destiny once more, a force guiding him toward challenges and opportunities far beyond the Salon, beyond Macedon, and into lands whose people, culture, and history were yet to feel the imprint of his ambition. The summer air over Aegae was thick and heavy, scented with sun-baked stone, olive groves, and the distant tang of the sea, and yet beneath this warmth simmered a tension as taut as a drawn bow. Philip, king of Macedon, the master strategist, the architect of a united Greece, moved through the palace with the confidence of a man who had seen victory after victory. Yet fate, unpredictable and cruel, had already begun to weave its threads around him. The court buzzed with activity. Nobles adjusted ceremonial robes, soldiers polished armor, and servants carried trays of wine and fragrant breads, all unaware of the storm that was about to strike. Alexander, now a young man of remarkable poise and intellect, observed with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and premonition. He had studied not only the arts of war and diplomacy but also the undercurrents of human ambition. He understood, as no one else might, the fragility of life even for a king whose power seemed absolute. The festival of celebration that Philip had convened to honor his latest victories and solidify alliances was in full swing. Music floated through the halls, the lyres and flutes weaving a melody both joyous and hypnotic, while dancers moved with grace, their movements echoing the subtle rhythm of courtly intrigue. Philip, regal and commanding, moved among his guests, offering smiles and handshakes, each gesture a careful calculation, each word layered with diplomacy and subtle authority. Then came the moment that would shatter Macedon's sense of security. The king, assassinated in the theater of celebration, felled by a dagger wielded with precise, silent intent. Chaos erupted instantly. Courtiers screamed, guards surged forward, and the scent of blood mingled with the fragrant oils of the hall. Alexander, near enough to witness the act, felt a cold clarity wash over him. In the midst of the panic, he remained calm, his mind racing through the implications of sudden death. Succession, loyalty, threat, and opportunity all converging in a single, terrifying instant. Olympias, fierce and undaunted even in the face of horror, gathered Alexander close, her eyes alight with both grief and a resolve that mirrored the prophecy she had once whispered into his ear, that he was destined for greatness beyond mortal measure. "Remember who you are," she whispered, her voice a sharp anchor amidst the chaos. "Your father's death is a signal, not a limit. Macedon needs you now, as the world will need you soon." Alexander, absorbing the weight of her words, acted with a decisiveness that would define his reign. He moved to secure the palace, calm in demeanor yet resolute in command, ordering loyal guards to ensure the safety of key figures and prevent further unrest. The courtiers and nobles, shocked and fearful, looked to him instinctively, recognizing in his composure the emergence of the new heir who would carry Macedon forward. In the days following Philip's death, Alexander confronted the delicate politics of succession. Factions within the court, some loyal, some opportunistic, tested the young prince's resolve, each subtle maneuver a reminder that kingship demanded not only inherited authority but immediate and perceptive action. He consolidated his allies, reassured the army, and sent messages to the city-states, asserting both continuity and strength. At night, when the palace quieted and the torchlight flickered across marble halls, Alexander walked through the gardens, Bucephalus at his side, reflecting on the fragility of life and the weight of destiny. The air was filled with the scents of jasmine and pine, the gentle rustle of leaves whispering as though mourning and guiding simultaneously. He considered the legacy of Philip, the lessons of Aristotle, and the uncharted path before him, a path that would soon stretch across continents, shaped by ambition, intellect, and the inexorable force of history. In that moment, Alexander understood that the death of his father was not merely an end but a passage, a threshold into a world of immense responsibility, peril, and possibility. The blood of Macedon had been spilled, but in its place rose a young king poised to command not only armies but the course of history itself, his resolve steeled by grief, foresight, and the unshakable certainty that destiny would not wait for hesitation. The palace of Aegae, still echoing with the grief and tumult of Philip's assassination, had become a place of both mourning and decisive action. Alexander, now king, moved through its halls with a measured urgency, the weight of authority pressing on his shoulders like a cuirass of iron and gold. Courtiers whispered, some in fear, others in cautious calculation, but the young king's presence demanded attention, his calm composure contrasting sharply with the uncertainty that surrounded him. Olympias remained ever near, her influence and resolve a constant source of counsel and inspiration. Together, they began the delicate task of consolidating power, securing loyalty from generals, nobles, and city-states alike. Alexander understood that a throne claimed by inheritance could be lost by hesitation, that perception was as vital as force, and that swift, decisive action could prevent opportunistic rivals from destabilizing Macedon before his reign truly began. He summoned trusted companions, including seasoned commanders and advisors, to reaffirm oaths of loyalty, weaving a network of allegiance fortified by both respect and fear. Each conversation, each promise, each subtle gesture was calculated to project strength and continuity. Beyond the palace, Alexander turned his attention to the military, aware that Macedon's security and his authority depended on both perception and preparedness. The army, still loyal to the memory of Philip yet uncertain of the new leadership, required reassurance and demonstration. Alexander reviewed formations, trained with the phalanx, and rode alongside the companion cavalry, not merely as a figurehead but as a participant, showing that skill, courage, and decisiveness accompanied his inherited authority. In parallel, he attended to diplomatic matters. Ambassadors from Greek city-states arrived, some with genuine intent, others seeking advantage in a period of transition. Alexander navigated these interactions with the precision of a seasoned strategist, asserting Macedonian primacy while offering subtle assurances of continuity and respect for alliances. The League of Corinth, already delicate in its cohesion, required careful reinforcement. Alexander dispatched envoys, conducted negotiations, and engaged in personal diplomacy, blending charm, intellect, and authority to secure the allegiance of cities whose loyalty could waver without constant attention. Within the palace, Alexander also addressed internal threats. Factions and rival nobles, emboldened by Philip's death, tested the boundaries of loyalty. Alexander acted decisively but judiciously, removing those whose ambition posed direct threat while rewarding loyalty and competence, establishing a precedent that would define his reign. Authority exercised with both firmness and foresight. The consolidation of power was not solely political or military. Alexander continued the education that Aristotle had begun, studying philosophy, ethics, history, and the sciences, understanding that a king's strength was amplified by wisdom and insight. He consulted with scholars, debated with rhetoricians, and reflected upon the lessons of both past empires and contemporary politics. Even as he maneuvered through these responsibilities, Alexander allowed moments of personal reflection and quiet connection. Riding Bucephalus through the hills surrounding Pella, he observed the countryside, the rhythms of daily life, and the subtle interplays of loyalty and fear among his people. These moments grounded him, a reminder that leadership encompassed both vision and intimacy, both ambition and awareness of the human heart. As autumn approached, Alexander's efforts began to bear fruit. The Macedonian army rallied firmly to his command, allies and city-states recognized the continuity of leadership, and the court settled into a tense but stable order. Yet the young king knew that true consolidation was not a static achievement but a dynamic process, requiring constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the ability to inspire both respect and fear. In the quiet of night, Alexander often stood on the palace terraces, the wind carrying scents of pine, jasmine, and distant seas, contemplating the path ahead. The death of Philip had opened a gateway into history, a threshold from which Macedon's destiny, and his own, would expand far beyond the familiar hills and valleys of the homeland, reaching toward the distant lands of Asia and the empires whose legends filled both scroll and imagination. And in that stillness, Alexander felt the steady pulse of ambition, the intertwining of intellect, courage, and destiny, as he prepared to lead not only a kingdom but a world poised for the sweep of conquest and the imprint of his vision. The city of Thebes, proud and stubborn, sat like a jewel in the rolling plains of Boeotia, its walls bathed in the golden light of early morning, yet shadowed by defiance and simmering unrest. The Thebans, resentful of Macedonian dominance and Philip's prior victories, had tested the young king's authority, daring to challenge Alexander's assertion of power shortly after his ascension. Alexander, aware that hesitation could invite rebellion, marched with the Macedonian army, the rhythmic clatter of armored feet and thundering hooves echoing across the plains. The companion cavalry, polished and disciplined, moved as a singular organism, a reflection of both strategy and loyalty, while the phalanx, spears bristling like a forest of steel, advanced in unyielding formation. Thebes had fortified its gates, reinforcing walls with timber and stone, while citizens scurried to supply barricades and weapons, their voices a mixture of fear, defiance, and fervor. Alexander, riding atop Bucephalus, surveyed the city with calculated intensity, noting both its strengths and vulnerabilities. He had learned from Philip and from the experiences of Chaeronea that timing, precision, and morale were as vital as brute force. Negotiations were attempted first, emissaries sent with words of warning and offers of leniency, but Thebes remained unyielding. Alexander understood then that diplomacy had its limits, that some walls could only be breached by courage and steel. The siege commenced with both strategy and discipline. Macedonian archers loosed volleys with relentless rhythm, while engineers prepared battering rams and scaling equipment. Siege towers advanced, their wheels creaking under the weight of anticipation and iron, and the army coordinated with an efficiency honed through prior campaigns. Inside the city, the bands resisted with courage, hurling stones, arrows, and boiling oil upon the attackers, their defiance fierce but ultimately constrained by the precise coordination of Macedonian forces. Alexander, leading from the front, inspired his men not merely by rank but by presence, entering moments of crisis to direct maneuvers, encourage soldiers, and exploit weaknesses in the defenses. The clash of shields, the groan of timber, and the cries of combatants filled the air, blending into a symphony of struggle that Alexander navigated with both tactical insight and instinct. The walls eventually fell, not simply by force but through calculated pressure, intimidation, and the demonstration of unyielding authority. The city surrendered, its leaders captured, and the populace faced consequences that, while harsh, were tempered by Alexander's recognition of both justice and strategy. The imposition of order without extinguishing the potential for loyalty. In the aftermath, Alexander walked through the city, observing the expressions of citizens, soldiers, and captives alike. He noted how fear, respect, and opportunity intertwined in the human psyche, how loyalty could be won as effectively by wisdom and measured mercy as by victory in battle. Bucephalus shifted beside him, the stallion's steady presence a silent reassurance amidst the tumult. The lessons of Thebes, Alexander reflected, were multifaceted: the necessity of decisive action, the interplay of diplomacy and force, and the ever-present potential for rebellion even in seemingly secure dominions. At night, atop the city walls, Alexander gazed across the plains of Boeotia, the fading sun painting the land in crimson and gold. He contemplated the delicate balance of fear, respect, and authority, and the complex web of alliances and enmities that stretched across Greece. Each victory reinforced his confidence, each challenge sharpened his mind, and each observation added to the growing understanding that leadership required both intellect and courage, calculation and intuition. The siege of Thebes was more than a military success. It was a crucible in which Alexander's emerging style of command, unyielding, insightful, and visionary, was further refined, preparing him for the far greater campaigns that lay beyond the familiar landscapes of Macedon and Greece, toward lands steeped in history, ambition, and the promise of empire. Alexander's journey from a young prince, guided by the wisdom of Aristotle and tempered in the trials of battle and courtly intrigue, to a king poised at the threshold of the vast Persian Empire, is a testament to ambition, intellect, and resilience. Each victory, each lesson in loyalty and strategy, each confrontation with both human and natural challenges, shaped him into a leader capable of commanding not only armies but the course of history itself. The lands of Macedon, Greece, and now Asia lay before him, vast and filled with both peril and possibility, and the legacy he would leave was already beginning to take shape in the hearts of soldiers, allies, and observers alike. Alexander's story reminds us that greatness is forged in the crucible of courage, wisdom, and the unyielding pursuit of destiny. A tale that resonates far beyond his own time, echoing through the ages as a chronicle of vision, power, and the enduring human drive to reach beyond the horizon.